Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. And thank you for your patience while we were just sorting some technical difficulties. Welcome to this TX InFocus webinar to support the September 2024 exams. My name is Hazel McLucas and I am an Education Partner Support Manager at ACCA. As the title of the webinar suggests, the Examiner's Report Unlocked, our session today is designed to support you with insights from the latest Examiner's Report of Taxation. Our expert tutor, Aileen Edgar, has joined us to help you with your upcoming exam preparation. And during this session, she'll take you through the technical examples from previous exams. She'll share practical advice for tackling the September exams as well. She'll also talk about strategies which you should adopt to avoid common pitfalls and improve your exam performance. And towards the end of the session, we'll also have a live Q&A. Before I hand over to Aileen, I'd like to just cover a few housekeeping items quite quickly. At the bottom of the screen, you'll see that there's a number of buttons that you can use. There's a help icon that provides resources and information to help you resolve any technical issues you might experience. There are icons for both slides and media player, and you'll need to see both of these during the webinar, so make sure you've selected them and you can see them on your screen now. There's an attendee chat function, so you can engage with fellow webinar attendees, but please do not share any personal information in the chat. And there's a resource list, and if you click into that, you'll be able to access resources that are relevant to today's webinars, and there's some direct links in there as well. You can rearrange your screen to suit and resize the windows if you need to. And if at any point you can't hear what we're saying or you can't see the screen, then please refresh your browser. Registering for this webinar means that you'll be sent an email tomorrow with details on how you can listen to it again. So don't worry if you miss something or if you have any technical issues, you'll be able to access the recording. I'm going to hand over to Aileen in a moment and I will be back with you towards the end of the session. But if you'd like to ask ACCA or Aileen a question, then please post them in the Q&A section. Please note we can't guarantee responding to everyone directly, either verbally or in the web chat, but we really hope that the questions that we share will be helpful for everyone. So I'll now hand over to Aileen.
Thank you very much, Hazel. And welcome to this webinar session today, everybody. I'm delighted to be here to pull out some of the best tips from the examiner on tackling the TX exam, to work through a selection of trickier questions with you, and also to answer any questions that you might have for me. So I've been a tax tutor since 2008, and I've had the privilege to work for two of the main accounting bodies in the UK as an employee. And now I work as a freelance tutor and examiner for many different learning providers, professional institutes, universities, as well as running my own courses for students through FME Learn Online's platform. And this experience means that I also get to be a guest expert on fabulous sessions like we've got today. So I'm really happy to be here with you all who are joining us live today. So let's get stuck into the main content that we'll be covering today. We're going to focus on the recently released examiner's report from the March-June 24 TX UK exam. It's a fantastic document, lots of tips and tricks in there, as well as real examples of the questions from those exams that you can test yourself with. So I'm going to be drawing out some of those tips in the session today and explaining how you can apply those to your own preparations for the September exam. We're going to cover some of the questions that were in those exams, giving you a chance to hear how to best approach them or get a better understanding of certain parts of the TX syllabus. And then I'll go through some broader top tips for your preparations as we move into the revision phase for the exam. And of course, you need to stick around to the end, because then we will have time for your own questions for me and the ACCA team. So please do start popping questions into the Q&A box on your screen. I will get to as many of them as I possibly can at the end. So I want to start off with just give me a thumbs up or a yes in the chat box, not the Q&A box, in the chat box, if you have read an examiner's report before. So yeah, thumbs up, thumbs down if you haven't, be honest. And just give me a bit of an idea as to what we're looking at in terms of your experience already of examiners' reports. Okay, we're getting a few thumbs up. That's good to see. Well done, because they are brilliant documents that are released normally twice a year and contain some great insights into the brain of the examiner. Oh, some honest thumbs down as well. Thank you for being honest. I'm hoping that today I'm going to convince you of how fantastic and valuable these documents are, and make sure that you go away and read it thoroughly. It's got some examples of real exam questions that you can practice, as well as giving you that insight into the examiner's brain. So they're fantastic. So I've gone through the most recent examiner's report for TX, and I've pulled out for you the best tips and advice from the examiner that are in that report. Now, what do you think is the point that the examiner makes most often in this report? What do you think they say most often? Do you think it's something about people not managing their time well enough, not reading the question maybe, or knowing your topics, that type of thing? Well, we're going to have a look, and you might be surprised actually as to what actually they say more often in the report. So the first thing that I noticed is they talk about revising the whole syllabus. So you cannot question spot for this exam. Yes, you know that there's going to be a 15-mark question in section C from the income tax area of the syllabus. And you know that there's going to be another 15-mark question from corporation tax. But those areas are so broad, and the examiner is always finding new ways to come at the same topic from. You need to have a breadth of knowledge from the TX syllabus. You don't need to be an expert in every area, but you do need to understand enough to be able to make a good attempt at section C questions and be able to eliminate some of the options for answers in the section A and the section B questions. In section C, some students were noted as wasting time recalculating figures that they've been given in the question. Now, there's no need to prove figures that you're given unless you're told there's some doubt over them. Like if we had a situation where, say, a junior member of staff had had a go at a capital allowances computation, but wasn't sure if they'd done it correctly or not, that's fair enough. You might want to recalculate there. But if you're not given that kind of steer, don't waste time recalculating figures that are given to you in the question. Unsurprisingly, the examiner does mention that students need to make sure that they are reading the questions carefully and answering what is actually being asked. All too often in an exam, when you're feeling stressed and you're time pressured, you read too quickly. Your brain sees what it wants to see. With tax, the precise wording of things is so important. And if you miss it, say asking for after tax proceeds, and just think it's asking for the tax figure, then you're missing out on easy marks. And I saw somebody was suggesting in the chat that that was something the examiner was going to bring up. And yes, they do. There are easy marks to pick up in the paper. You don't want to be missing out on those. Now, the examiner also noted there was a question that was very similar to one of the technical articles for TX. It's freely available on the ACCA Student Study Resources page of the website. And students who struggled with that particular question clearly hadn't read the article or hadn't spent enough time on it. In the 10-mark question in section C, there was a calculation of income tax that contained some exempt items like a pension contribution, where the student didn't need to do anything with the number they were given. But many students missed out on the mark available there because they didn't show that they knew this by putting pension in as 0 or by writing a quick explanation of that fact. Now, something I know you will hear tutors and ACCA recommend all the time, of course, is question practice. And this was indeed also mentioned in the examiner's report. They were making the point that well-prepared candidates were able to deal with certain parts of the exam pretty quickly and efficiently, probably because they'd seen similar questions before and spent time revising their exam technique on those. But by far the most frequently commented on issue from the most recent examiner's report is about taking shortcuts in computations. Maybe that's a bit surprising to you. Several times in the examiner's report, the examiner mentions that students didn't actually have to do full computations and so wasted time by doing so. So we had one of the requirements in section C where students were being asked to work out the tax payable by 3 different directors. Now, they all had the same level of income. So it would have been quicker to do one computation for one of the directors and then just multiply that up by 3. But many students just did the full income tax computations for each of the directors, taking up lots of valuable time. Similarly, we had a situation in one of the 15-mark questions where students didn't need to do a full separate capital allowances computations, with the columns and the headings, etc., because the calculation was actually really straightforward and therefore really not worth the amount of time that some students spent on it. Now, later in this session, we are going to look at some ideas for how you can avoid these pitfalls when it's your turn for this exam. So we are going to revisit these things that the examiner was pointing out. Now, all of those things the examiner had to say were about where students were going wrong, but there must have been things that they were doing right, mustn't there? And we can certainly learn from the mistakes others have made in exams gone by, but let's spend a little bit of time looking at what the examiner had to say about what they were doing well from the March and June 24 exams. So they noted that there was a number of perfect corporation tax computations, adjustments of profits, taxable income answers. And absolutely, if you've done your question practice and you're comfortable with adjustments, you're comfortable with tax rates, you're comfortable with the rules around what's allowable and what's not, you can get perfect scores in section C. You can pick up the marks for multiple choice questions. They also noticed that people were quite good at comparing figures that had been calculated under different scenarios. Now, if people were missing out on marks in that, it's maybe because they haven't read the requirement properly and they missed the part where it said we have to compare. It's not just about working out the numbers, you've got to compare them to come to some sort of conclusion. So careful reading of the requirement was being done by lots of students to spot this, and therefore they were picking up all the marks. Brilliant. And really positive to see, because I do think that pensions and things to do with cars can be some of the trickier parts of the TX syllabus. But actually, from the March and June exams, the examiner noticed that lots of people were doing really, really well. And that shows that they've recognised that those are tricky areas and they've spent time really trying to understand it and doing question practice. They've not hid away from it, hoping that it'll just not come up in the exam. So there was lots of really positive things to take away from the examiner's report and how people did with the previous exams there. So what can we learn then? We need to know the basics of trading profit adjustments, income tax computations, corporation tax computations. You need to understand the difference between personal and occupational pensions. People get really confused about that. Company cars and payments for using your own car for work. And you need to know your exemptions. You need to be able to spot things that are exempt from tax really quickly. So things like ISAs, cash gifts, etc. You don't want to waste time on calculations for those when they're exempt. Now we're going to spend a wee bit of time looking at some examples of questions from each of the sections of the examiner's report. just to talk through some of the common mistakes that students have been making when faced with these questions in those recent exams. Now, the first example I want to look at is from Section A, and it concerns how we work out Class 1 NIC. Please feel free to have a go at this question while you see it on the screen if you can work that quickly, but no pressure to. I'm going to go through it, and you might want to just sit and listen to what I'm saying as I talk through the approach to this question. So we've got someone here with a salary. They are an employee. They've been provided with a loan, and that resulted in a taxable benefit of £1,500. They contributed into their occupational pension scheme, and their employer also contributed into that pension scheme. And what we're being asked to do is work out the earnings figure that we should use for calculating Class 1 NIC. We're not being asked to work out Class 1 NIC. We're being asked to work out what the earnings figure is. There's lots of figures in this question, but your starting point needs to be your understanding of that earnings definition for NIC purposes. And they are not the same thing as earnings for income tax purposes or pension purposes. So this is actually quite tricky. Now, you might be thinking, but it doesn't say whether it's employers Class 1 or employees Class 1 NIC, and indeed that is true. But the reason is because the categorisation is the same for each type of Class 1 NIC. It doesn't matter which type specifically we're being asked about. The earnings definition is the same. So earnings for NIC purposes includes salary, bonuses and vouchers, but you don't include exempt employment benefits and taxable benefits. You also don't deduct any deductions like pension contributions or professional subscriptions. So for Mina, we have salary of 68,000, which we will count, and we'll ignore the taxable benefit of £1,500 for the loan, as well as ignoring the pension contributions, both hers and her employer's. So what that means then is the correct answer here is £68,000. Okay, so well done if you knew that, but this is trickier. I have pulled out some of the trickier examples from the examiner's report here. So if this is something you're not familiar with, please do go and spend some time looking at that part of the syllabus again. Now, the next example question I want to look at is also from Section A, concerns the VAT flat rate scheme. We've got an individual here who's already using the scheme. We're being asked to work out their VAT liability for the year. Again, we've got lots of numbers to pick through, don't we? So let's have a quick reminder of the flat rate scheme then. It is a simplification scheme for VAT to make life easier for small businesses. The VAT liability is worked out by multiplying your total turnover, so that is VAT inclusive and includes taxable and exempt turnover, by the given flat rate percentage. You'll be given a percentage in the exam to use. And no input tax recovery is therefore allowed because this computation we do works out the fair amount. So returning to our question then, how do we work out the VAT liability here? We first of all need to know that what the total VAT inclusive turnover figure is for the year. So first of all, that's going to be taking the standard rated sales and working out what the VAT inclusive figure would be for them, because we've been given a net of VAT figure. Net of VAT means it excludes VAT. And if we're given a VAT exclusive figure like that and we want the VAT inclusive figure, we need to multiply it up by 120%. And then since we need all the sales figures, we have to add in the zero rated sales of £30,000. Now there's no VAT to add on them because they're taxable at zero. So total VAT inclusive turnover here is going to be the 120,000 for standard rated sales plus the 30,000 for our zero rated sales. So we're getting total VAT inclusive sales of 150,000. Okay, hope that makes sense so far. So now we're going to apply the flat rate percentage we were given in the question of 11% to that figure. and we get £16,500. Now, common mistakes students make with this kind of question is to not work out what the VAT inclusive amount is for the standard rate of sales, or they missed out the zero rate of sales altogether and didn't include those. So if we look back at the full question again, can you see that there was a figure there we didn't actually use? It was the 15,000 purchases figure. And that's because when you're using the flat rate scheme, you don't get to deduct anything for input tax suffered. That percentage that we're told, that 11% in this case, is worked out for each industry as a sort of average amount of recovery that is generally applicable to businesses in that sector. So you just work out the amount of output tax payable to HMRC and ignore any input tax suffered. Now, if anyone's got any particular questions about these sample questions as we're going through, please do feel free to pop them into the Q&A box. I can pick them up later on then. Next, we're going to look at a couple of questions from section B. So here we've got one where we've got an investment property that's been sold. It had been purchased many years before, and we're given the proceeds figure, the purchase price, and some legal fees that were incurred on purchase as well, and the indexation factor. What are we being asked to do? Work out what the allowable loss is on the disposal of the property in 2023. And we're given 4 options. So do you understand what you have to do here? Did the phrase allowable loss maybe throw you off? Because we don't often see that kind of phrase. This is a capital gains computation. It's for a company. So you want to start off with the proceeds figure and then deduct cost and perhaps indexation allowance. So that's the kind of structure for your capital gains computation for a company. So we're going to start off with the proceeds figure, and it was 436. We're going to deduct from that the costs of the property, which include the original purchase price, but also those associated legal fees that were connected with the original purchase. So that gives us an unindexed gain of £116,000. The indexation allowance would be worked out using the indexation factor you were given in the question of 0.438, multiply that up by the total cost of 315,250 plus the 4,750, because those are all the costs to do with the property. And that would come to 140,160. Now we've got a problem here, because we're not allowed to use indexation allowance to either create a loss or make a loss bigger. So the most that we're allowed to do here is to use the allowance to bring the gain down to 0. So do you see that the actual indexation allowance figure is 140,160, but we're only actually using 116,000 of that, because we cannot end up with a loss because we've applied indexation. It's just the rule. HMRC will not allow that. So hopefully, now that you've seen that, you're going to remember that if it comes up in the exam. So if that's something you don't feel like you've seen many examples of, please do go and have a look at the examiner's report and try that question again yourself, just to make sure that you've committed that to memory. Now, next, we've got a question about rollover relief for a company. So we've got a freehold factory. It's made a gain of 159,000 when it was sold. It was calculated by proceeds less index cost. And we're being asked, how much does the company have to invest in a replacement asset to be able to benefit from partial rollover relief? And they've been really helpful. I know it might not feel like it, but they have been really helpful. And they've said what they mean by that is we're looking for more than 0, but less than the full gain. So you've been told the gain, which is 159,000. And then you see the options, and you'll see that the options also tie in with that, because we have options that run from like £1, and we've got one that ends at 158,999. So that means it's in between those big endpoints of 0 and 159,000. So they try to make this as clear as they can, because this is a tricky question. Okay, it's a question about rollover relief, but really it's testing how much you understand of what you're doing with it, and a bit of tax planning as well. So if you've done lots of rollover relief questions and you've just gone through the calculations every time, you might still find this really tricky, because it's looking at rollover relief from a slightly different angle than you've maybe seen before. So let's think about how we decide how much of a gain can be deferred under rollover relief. Okay, so a reminder of the rules. In order to get a full deferral of the gain, you would have to reinvest all of the proceeds amount from the sale of asset number 1 into asset number 2. But we're not being asked to work out how we get a full deferral. We're being asked, how do we get a partial deferral? And to get a partial deferral, you need to reinvest some of the proceeds, but not all of the proceeds from asset 1 into asset 2. And the amount of the gain that is chargeable now, so therefore cannot be rolled over, is the lower of two things. It's the lower of the amount of proceeds that have not been reinvested and the full amount of the gain. So that's the rule about rollover relief. So that's a recap for you to get that in your head, and we'll look at this question again because it is tricky. You need to think about why they've given you certain figures that they have. You've got options available to you as well, thank goodness. So you know the right answer is there in front of you in one of the 4 options that you've been given. They've not just given you the gain, they've also given you how the gain was arrived at. So this must be for some sort of reason. So start by setting out what the gain comp looks like for asset number 1. We've got proceeds of 294 less index cost of 135 to get that gain of 159. And what we want to see is how can we defer some, but not all of that gain of 159,000. So we need to be thinking about how much of that proceeds figure of 294 should be reinvested to achieve that. Now, one way to go about this is take each of the 4 possible answers that were given to you in the question and see if the numbers work out. You can maybe eliminate some of the options, then leave you with one that you're confident in. It could take a while, and really what I want to make sure is that you're understanding what the examiner's trying to test here. So let's think about how we best approach it. Rather than going for the, let's just work through each of the 4 options and try and figure out with those numbers which is the right answer. Let's actually just try and work it out. So even if they hadn't given us any of those numbers, we could have said what it is. So let's think about it again. The gain that's chargeable now is the lower of the amount of proceeds not reinvested and the full gain amount. Now our gain amount is £159,000. So once the proceeds that we do not reinvest goes above that 159,000, the full gain is going to be taxable now and nothing can be deferred. So we don't want to breach that. 159,000 of proceeds not invested would mean that we're investing 135,000. Why? Because the difference between our proceeds figure of 294, the amount we could reinvest, and that gain figure of 159 is 135,000. So if we don't reinvest 159,000 of proceeds, it means we are reinvesting 135 into asset 2. So to get some sort of rollover relief, the proceeds that we reinvest need to be no less than £135,001, because we're saying the amount of proceeds not being reinvested needs to be no more than 158,999. The reinvestment amount needs to be less than 294, because if it was 294, the full gain would be deferred, and we were told not to do that. So that leads us to choosing A as the right answer. It's the amount that is between the index cost figure and the proceeds figure. Now this is, I think, out of all the questions in the examiner's report, I thought this was the toughest. What do you think? Do you agree that that's pretty tough? You could know rollover relief really well in the computations and still find that difficult. So do go and have a look at it in the examiner's report, sit with it, go through all the different options and just see how the numbers work out and just satisfy yourself that A is the right answer because it's the difference between the index cost figure and the proceeds figure. But it is really, really tough. And I think if you get something like that in the exam, you've got to keep an eye on your time. You don't want to be spending so much time on it that you miss out on other questions that you're more comfortable with and should be happily, securely getting the marks. If you need to guess, you need to guess if you run out of time. Remember, you've got the little flag feature in the exam where you can just put a little flag on a question and come back to it later on once you've tackled other things. So I do think it seems to be the toughest question, I think, anyway, out of the examiner's report. So let's move on to section C now, where at least you're going to get marks for partial calculations. And even if you make a mistake, you're still going to get some of the credit. One of the things we said earlier was that you shouldn't question spot and you need to have a good breadth of knowledge of this syllabus. Now, I would say that one of the less well-studied areas of the income tax part of the syllabus is around payrolling of benefits. Are you thinking the same? Are you sitting there going, oh, what's payrolling of benefits? Or, oh, I vaguely remember this? Yeah, be honest. I'm sure plenty of you are. It isn't one of the main things that people think about when they're studying their income tax. But there was a 2-mark requirement in the exam. So let's do a quick recap of the rules and some key things from the examiner's report on this. It came up in section C for a 2-mark requirement. Students were asked to state 2 advantages for an employee if their employer had payrolled the taxable benefits provided to the employee. So to answer this, first of all, you need to understand what payrolling of benefits is, of course. So here's a summary of it for you. The employee is going to pay tax on the benefit throughout the year via pay-as-you-earn, so on a real-time basis. Excuse me. It avoids any unexpected tax liabilities. The employee doesn't have to report the benefit on their tax return. There is a cash flow drawback for the employee because they're going to pay tax earlier than they would if it was going on their tax return. And their employer doesn't need to report the benefit on P11Ds, so that saves the employer some admin time. So the correct answer was to make a couple of points saying that income tax should not be underpaid, so there's not going to be any unexpected tax liabilities for the employee, and there's no need for the employee to declare the benefits on their self-assessment return. Now, note there were no marks there for discussing disadvantages of payrolling benefits, and there was no marks there for talking about advantages to the employer rather than the employee. It is absolutely critical that you answer only what has been asked, as even if what you're saying is technically correct, if it's not been asked for, then there are going to be no marks for it and you are just wasting time. So what you've not to do, if you see a question like this, is go, oh, it's about payrolling of benefits. Here's everything I know about payrolling of benefits. You're wasting your time. You're spending too much time on this question. You should be using that time elsewhere. You need to read carefully. So lessons to be learnt from this, as highlighted in the examiner's report. You need to cover all parts of the syllabus because there will be some areas that you may well have seen fewer questions on, but they could still come up in your exam. And also you must read the requirement and answer what has been asked and only what has been asked of you. Okay? Super important exam technique. Finally, we're going to look at some corporation tax and the 4-mark requirement at the end of the paper. Now, this corporation tax 15-mark question was actually split into 3 parts with 3 separate unrelated companies. So actually, you could have just started with this 4-mark requirement if you wanted to, because it wasn't connected to the rest of the question at all. It was asking us to calculate the amount of corporation tax that this particular company is going to save for the year by taking 3 measures. prior to their year-end date. Now, the information we have on the company is that it's expecting to make higher profits than normal. It's looking for some tax planning measures to reduce its tax bill. It's got 3 options, and the requirement asked us to calculate the amount of corporation tax saved if these 3 measures had been put in place during the year. Now, the first one was to do with the purchase of cars that would qualify. They would qualify for first year allowance because they've got 0 emissions. And as such, they would get capital allowances of £64,000, and this would therefore save tax at 25%. Why? Because this is a company that's paying tax at a higher rate because it's got that big level of profits that it's expecting that you were told in the question. What about the dividends? Do you think paying dividends during the year to the company shareholders of £60,000 is going to save tax? I want to see thumbs up or thumbs down or yeses or nos in the chat box. What do you think? Dividend of £60,000 paid to company shareholders during the year, is that going to save tax? Yes or no? Thumbs up, thumbs down, yes or no in the chat box. What do you think? Let me see. Want to see some thumbs coming across the screen. What do you think? Getting some no's and thumbs down in the chat. Brilliant. Lots of no's. A few yeses. So, yep, a wee bit of confusion around this. That's normal. I would say most of you have spotted that it wouldn't result in any tax saving at all. No tax saving. Why? Because dividends are paid out of post-tax profits. They don't have any impact on your tax bill at all. What about the rent then? We've got rent of £18,000 covering the 6-month period, 1st of April to the end of September 24. They're going to pay it in advance. Is that going to save them tax? Well, in this case, it's going to be a no. No tax saving from this. Why? Your financial statements need to be prepared on an accruals basis. We don't adjust for that for tax purposes for a company, so it's going to have no impact on our tax bill either. So out of the 3 options there of things that they're going to do during the year, only that first one to do with the cars is actually going to have any impact on the tax bill. Okay, so that's us gone through those, what I think are some of the trickier parts of that examiner's report, but there are other questions, so do make sure you go and have a look at the examiner's report and try the other questions as well yourself. Okay, with all those things in mind, let's think now about practical things that you can be doing over the next few weeks so that you're increasing your chances of passing by getting into some good habits and increasing your technical and your approach skills. Hopefully by now you have completed the whole of the syllabus and you can move into the revision phase if you haven't already done so. So what are the key things you should be doing for TX in this crucial phase of your studying? Well, question practice. No surprise there. This should be the main focus of your study activities now. Even if you haven't fully covered the syllabus, or maybe you feel some bits of the syllabus are a wee bit weaker than others, you just don't have time now to be doing only reading, memorising of notes, that type of thing. You need to learn from question practice and making mistakes. It's one of the best ways to learn and remember all these different tax rules anyway. Making mistakes at this stage is absolutely fine. Please don't be afraid of it. I feel like too many people are scared of making mistakes. This is how you learn. It's better to make mistakes now than in the real exam, isn't it? But as you're making the mistakes, what you need to do though is spend time figuring out why. Is it lack of knowledge? Is it that you didn't read the question properly? Redo questions that you've been making mistakes on. Boost your confidence by getting them right, because now you understand it by spending some time either revising an area that you're not so good on, or, oh yes, I missed that bit of information in the scenario. Now I know it's there. I'm going to redo the question and I get it right. You're going to feel better, you know? So don't just make mistakes and go, oh yeah, I'll do that properly the next time. You need to physically make yourself redo things where you're making mistakes. Now, with TX, yes, it is a calculation subject, of course. But there's actually quite a lot of questions in there that are narrative in nature. Please don't skip past those styles of question when you're doing your revision. I want you to be thinking, be really honest with yourself. There's no point kidding yourself. Have a think about your own question practice. Do you just seek out numbers? Do you see wordy questions and go, ugh, I can't be bothered? Don't do this, please. There's a lot of narrative questions in the exam. You need to be able to tackle those as well. You need to understand admin rules, conditions for release, how to apply certain rules like residency. All of these things are a must for this exam. Don't just focus on big computations like capital allowances and income tax liabilities. Now, sitting at least one mock, ideally more though, under exam conditions is one of the best things that you can do, I promise. Please don't say, I don't feel ready. How on earth do you think you're going to feel sitting in that exam if you don't try now? None of the athletes we've seen competing at the Olympic Games recently, they don't just turn up on the day hoping for the best. They have put in so much practice. They have made so many mistakes. They have failed many, many times, but they have kept going. They have learned where their weaknesses are. They've been really honest. They've taken on advice and they have put in the hours. And so can you. Now, one thing that doing a mock is really, really helpful for is deciding what order you should be attempting your questions in. So you've got 3 sections in TX. You can choose whichever one you want to start with. Some students prefer to start with section C because you get partial credit for those longer style questions, even if you make a mistake somewhere. Multiple choice questions in section A and B, they're not so forgiving with mistakes. If you start with section C, some people find that really calming because they're not just jumping from one question quickly to another as quickly as you are when you're doing section A. Other students, they find the amount of reading and information in a section C question a bit overwhelming at the start of an exam when those nerves are maybe at their highest. So by starting off with some short questions in section A, they actually find that they calm down. Now, I don't know many students who actually start with section B. Let me know in the chat, what section do you normally start with an exam? Do you start with section A, B, or C? If you haven't really thought about it before, please do now start thinking about this. It can make a massive difference to your time management and your nerves in the exam. Now, the benefit of sitting mocks under timed conditions is you can experiment with this ahead of time. You can find out what works for you. What worked for performance management or audit might not work for you with TX. So try it one way with one mock and then switch it around for a second mock. See which way helps you to manage your time and your nerves the best. Now, one of the best tools that is available to you to help you with all of these things is ACCA's practice platform. It's got specimen and practice papers. It's got a mock. It's got other past papers, all there for free for you to access and have a go at on software that replicates the exam environment. You can access solutions as well on there. You can self-mark any of those papers to check on your progress. So I'd like to know how many of you have used the practice platform before and are using it to help you practice questions for this exam. So we're going to see with a quick poll. So, do you practice questions on the practice platform? Yes? No? Yeah, sometimes. Probably could do better. What are you? Are you an A, a B, or a C? You should be able to click on the options there on the screen for you. Let's see how people are using this. Okay, Good. This is really pleasing to see. I'm so pleased to see so many of you practicing questions on the platform. Even if you're only doing it sometimes, if you can increase it, please do. If you're practicing on pen and paper, please stop. You need to be practicing on software that you're going to use in the exam. Okay, now's the time. Yeah, and you know what? If you're having problem accessing the practice platform, if you're using Excel or Word, you know, that's better certainly than using pen and paper. Okay, but use the practice platform as much as you possibly can. So we've looked at so far some of the mistakes students were making in the most recent exams in terms of exam technique and also understanding of technical topics. And we've looked at the revision phase and we've looked at some tips for getting the best use out of this time that you've got. Now let's look at some practical things that you can do to avoid falling into the same traps other students have fallen into in their exam as highlighted in the examiner's report. Okay, question spotting. If you know at this stage, with a few weeks to go until the exam now, not long, that there are parts of the TX syllabus that you have been avoiding, it is time to get serious now. Give yourself the best chance in this exam. You do not want to sit this exam again. So spend a couple of hours going through your study materials or the ACCA Study Hub on the topic that you are avoiding. Write out some flashcards with key points. Try some multiple choice questions to begin with. Learn from those. Don't worry about being perfect. You need to have enough knowledge about each area of the syllabus to be able to give a question a decent attempt and maximise your marks. You will absolutely kick yourself if you end up with 49% in that exam and there was a question on, say, residency rules for individuals and you had avoided it because it felt too hard. Okay? Do not put yourself in that position. Okay, second issue that we had come up in the examiner's report was people wasting time recalculating figures given to them in the question. It doesn't come up too often in the exams, but you are told, if you're told a tax liability, say for a previous year, there's no indication you're expected to check or recalculate, just accept it. Use it in your answer as given. Okay? What about not answering the question? Well, this can be in the multiple choice questions, longer style questions. Often, one of the other options in an MCQ will be using figures that a student who hasn't read the question properly might be expected to use. So take your time, read the requirements a couple of times before you start, keep checking back to them as you create your answer. Check the requirement one more time before you move on to the next exam question, please. Not using technical articles. There's a wealth of free resources available to you on the study support resources pages of the ACCA website under taxation. Technical articles, topic explainer videos on a wide variety of topics. They've got tips and worked examples. Make sure you read them or watch the videos, not just once. Look at them again in that week leading up to your exam. What about not putting zeros in? Well, in section C, when you are, say, working out trading profit adjustments, make sure that there is something, if there's something that's exempt or you're not adjusting for it, show that with a 0, a nil, a dash in your answer, so your marker can be sure you actually understand the rules and have made a conscious choice not to adjust for it. Otherwise, the marker assumes that you missed out that transaction or didn't know what to do with it. Don't leave these easy marks on the table. What about lack of question practice? What can you do? Too much time spent rewriting notes and lists and too little time practicing questions and reviewing your answers is likely to lead to a fail in this exam. You need to be spending most of your time on question practice now. Don't just batter through as many questions as physically possible. You must spend time reviewing your answers and really understanding why you're making those mistakes. Otherwise, you're just going to repeat the same mistakes in the real exam. And then that commonly brought up point of doing full computations all the time. This is the one that the examiner mentioned most often. When they put the exam together and they're working out how long it would take a student to get through what's being asked of them, they are assuming that you are not doing unnecessary computations. So if you are doing unnecessary computations and not taking shortcuts, you're running out of time. You're spending too long on this. you're sacrificing time elsewhere in the paper. It's not worth it. So failing to spot shortcuts is a lack of confidence in your technical understanding of the whole process. It's maybe just rushing into something without really thinking about it. So spend more time planning, thinking. A minute or two makes all the difference. Think about just not your technical answer, but how are you going to approach it? What calculations do you need to do? Do your workings need to be separate? Could you just put it in a line on the computation itself? A really great place to go for help on this is the technical article on higher skills. You'll find it on the TX technical article page on the study support resources page on the ACCA website. It is brilliant and it talks about this very issue. Please make sure you read it if you haven't already. Okay then, another little quiz for you. Nothing too taxing this time. We have a mock for you, an extra one on the practice platform that you can have a go at. And there's debrief videos coming out. Do you know when that's all happening? Let's see what you're thinking. How many people have paid attention to emails that you should have received and communications that should be out there on the social media, ACCA social media, if you're following that. And if you're not, you should be, because you get lots of reminders and tips as well. Okay, let's see how we're doing. Do we know the answer? Yes, most of you know. The mock is out already. It's on the practice platform. That's where you'll find it. And then debrief videos come out tomorrow. So make sure you look out for those as well. But do have a go at the mock first. That's really important. You'll get the best use of it if you do it yourself first and then watch the debrief videos. So let's look at some of the questions that have been coming in now. If you do have a burning question, you've not put it in the Q&A box yet, please, please, please pop it in now. I know we started a wee bit late, so I'm sure I will be kept right as to when we're going to finish up, but I'm going to try and whiz through as many of your questions in the Q&A box as I can. I know the team have been answering any ones that they've been able to as well. Okay, is the mock exam available anytime to practice? Yes, it's on the practice platform, so you can have a go at that any point that you like. Please do it first before you watch the debrief videos. You'll need to end the exam and then go into the self-mark tab to be able to go in and see the solutions, just so you know that. Let's see, what else? How to pass first attempt. Okay, you need to have a good breadth of knowledge of TX. It's a really big syllabus. There's a lot of rules. You must be doing question practice. It's not enough to just have all that knowledge in your head and hope that you can kind of brain dump that in the exam. These exams do not work like that. These are professional exams in the professional exam, so it's not about a brain dump at all. Okay, is it worth doing past papers which don't follow Finance Act 23? I would say try and steer clear of them. There have been quite a lot of changes between Finance Act 22 and Finance Act 23. Up to that point, it was fairly stable in terms of rule changes, but we had quite a few new things come in and some things go out of the syllabus in Finance Act 23. So you do not want to waste your time confusing yourself over old things. So your best thing to do is make sure you're using an approved learning provider who is providing you with updated past paper questions. But you will find that some of the ones on the practice platform are updated to Finance Act 23. So focus on those ones. So I think that covers off a couple of people's questions there. Oh, great question about beneficial loans. Okay, so this is in the income tax part of the syllabus. It's an employee benefit if they're given a loan at a reduced rate or no rate of interest compared to what they can commercially get. Now, there's two different approaches to this. There's two different sort of formula or approaches. Which method to use in the exam? Both, or will it be specified if you need to use one particular method? Yes, great question. If they tell you to use a specific method, you will use that one and don't worry about doing the other option. If the question is silent on it and there's just a beneficial loan and they've not hinted what method to use, you must do both. There'll be marks for both. okay? You then pick the one that gives you the lower value, but you do just need to bear in mind and probably make your client aware that HMRC can come along and say, hey, I see you use the lower one, I want you to use the higher value, and therefore you'll pay more tax. But you'll use the one that gives you the lower, but you need to work them both out so that you know that. Great question. A question here that was relating back to when we were looking at one of the example questions from the examiner's report, which had asked for 2 advantages. So the question is, if a question asks for 2 advantages, do we write 2 points or 4 points? Brilliant question. You're never going to know for sure. I think I presume you're meaning for like bullet points, things to say. You definitely only write 2 advantages. There is no point in you giving 3 unless you think maybe one of them is a wee bit shaky and you're not confident if it's a really good one or not. Then no harm if you've got another one up your sleeve firing 3 down. But you're not going to get more than the marks available. The marker will just mark what's in front of them against the marking scheme. In terms of the number of bullet points, people do ask that question a lot in terms of, okay, if we are doing, if it's a 2-mark question, does that mean 2 bullet points? Not always. There's a lot of half marks in the section C questions. So sometimes it's maybe there's 4 half marks available and sometimes it's 2 1 marks. You're not going to know that, but try and make, if it's 4 marks, I think, and it's only asking you for 2 advantages, I think you'd be wanting to make quite well-developed points. It's not going to be enough just to write a couple of words down. So try and use that as a rule of thumb. In section C questions, should we mention that the provision that's used or the application is fine? I'm not 100% sure what that's meaning. Provision that's used or the application is fine. No, I'm sorry, I'm not quite following that question there, sorry. Can you use K for thousands? Yes, absolutely. You can use abbreviations, IHT, CGT, AEA. Your marker knows what all of these mean. So you can save yourself some time with abbreviations, definitely. Okay, we're just going to run on for a couple of minutes because I know we started a wee bit late, so I'm just going to try and get through the last couple of questions in here. Can you refer to past examiners' reports which are prior to June 24 exams with the new provisions? Oh, new rules. Yeah. Okay, so yes, read previous, start with the latest one and then go back maybe 2, 3, 4 examiners' reports. Yes, the examples in them are based on the syllabus at the time of that exam, but you can learn a lot from what the examiner's saying on common mistakes people are making. So I would start with the most recent ones and then go back 2 or 3 or 4 until you start to see patterns coming through in the comments. The questions themselves won't be updated to the new syllabus. Can we give clues for section C? Well, anything is examinable. I know it's not the answer people want to know, but it is the honest truth. What you do know about section C is that you will have a 15-mark question that comes from the income tax area of the syllabus and a 15-mark question that comes from this corporation tax part of the syllabus. So we do know that. And we know we have a 10-mark question, which is more higher skills. It's more to do with tax planning or a few different things kind of put together. And that article I mentioned earlier is absolutely brilliant for helping you with that 10-mark question. In terms of specific topics, no, there are no clues. It is amazing how many different angles the examiner can come at on income tax. It could be working out an income tax liability. It could just be working out somebody's employment income. It could be somebody's a sole trader and you're just looking at trading adjustments. That all falls under income tax. So they can be quite different. And last question, I'm just going to, 2 things, right? Time management. Any trick to complete exam in time, you have to move on. You need to practice using mocks, practice your time management. If you find that by starting with section C, you tend to run over in time, practice starting with section A first, see if that helps. In Section C, you do not need to finish a whole computation. You're picking up half marks all the way. If you run out of time and you need to move on to do Section A, just stop. Just stop what you're doing in Section C. Please do not feel you have to finish a capital allowances computation to get all the marks. You don't. You'll have picked up lots of marks already. And final thing, advice to give someone who has booked the TX exam for September and has covered 50% of the syllabus so far. Okay, biggest examinable areas: income tax, corporation tax, capital gains tax. Those are the three biggest areas. I hope those are the areas that you have already covered. If you have not covered corporation tax, that has to be a priority. It depends what order you've attempted the syllabus in so far. You need to start doing question practice, because if you don't do that, you're going to really struggle. So you're going to have to split your time between question practice and finishing as much as you can of the syllabus, but concentrate on the biggest tax areas. But the thing with these exams is the whole of the syllabus is examinable. You can't question spot. But yeah, focus on question practice, and I hope that you do okay and you get through what time you've got left. Right, I'm going to finish up there. Thank you, everybody, for all those amazing questions.
So, as Aileen said, we do need to bring things to a close now, and I hope that you found today's live session very useful. Just quickly before we go, I'd like to remind you about the important resources that are updated in the resources section of the webinar. So you'll find the slides from today's session. You'll also find the pre-September 2024 mock and debrief support. There's the latest examiner report, technical articles and topic explainers, and there's also links to ACCA Study Hub and ACCA Student Study Resources YouTube channel. Everyone who registered for the webinar will get an email tomorrow if you want to listen to it again. And I'd like to thank everyone for joining today. And finally, thank you, Aileen, for extending your support, and to the team in the background who have supported deliver this session. I wish you all the best with your exams. Have a good rest of your day.